Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today as part of our contribution towards London Climate Action Week. I have a brilliant panel with me today who I will introduce momentarily as more of you come into the webinar room. Hope you're all enjoying a gorgeous day outside today. And thank you for taking the time to come and listen to us. Good, I'll just wait for a few more people to come in. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. It is London Climate Action Week, if you hadn't already noticed. And today we will be talking to a really enthusiastic panel, and we're going to be talking about beyond profit. How can the economy evolve to support people and planet? My name's Lisa Ashford, and I am CEO of Ethex, the Direct Impact Investment Platform. I'll be your chair today, and if I could just quickly run through who is joining us today. We have Erinch Sahan, who is Business and Enterprise Lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And if you've seen this webinar advertised, you'll have seen the donuts flying around. So Erinch is going to be providing the donuts today. So following that, Mary Stevens, Experiments and Program Manager at Friends of the Earth. Welcome, Mary. Great to see you. Emma Newman, who is author, podcaster, and Money Movers Ambassador, and we'll be hearing more about what that is later in the session today. And Tammy Schweischler, founder and CEO of United Repair Centre, an excellent example of circular economy in action and how that contributes to a donut economy. We'll be talking about that a bit later. So literally, the title of the webinar says it all. We're going to be using the donut economy theory as a theory of a more progressive and sensitive model to the world we live in, and thinking about what that world might look like, how we can help achieve better, healthier economy, and real life examples looking at an innovative business model. So I'm going to turn to Erinch before we start with the rest of the panel. And I might just add that you can ask any questions you would like via the chat function as we go along. I'll feed those into the conversation, and we can always take Q&A at the end as well. We have an hour for the session. But Erinch, if you'd like to kick off and introduce us to all things donuts.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Wonderful to be with you all. So I'm here to talk about donuts and the donut. And this is the one donut that is actually good for you. It's the one donut that is, it's good that it's sticky, and it hopefully sticks in people's mind. But essentially, I'm going to switch into my background here. Essentially, the donut tells us that we have two fundamental boundaries that we must not transgress. We must build an economy within these two boundaries. On the outside are the 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists have told us we must not transgress. We must stay within these boundaries. Of course, climate change is one of these, but not just climate change. It's the way we treat our soils, our air, our biodiversity, whole range of ecological factors that are in a fine balance that allow us to thrive on this phenomenally life-inducive planet that we happen to occupy. And on the inside, there's an additional boundary, because not only do we need to stay short of those ecological planetary boundaries, but we also need to make sure we are providing the essentials of life. So we cannot fall short on the essentials of life, which are the social foundations, that inner green concentric circle you see just above my shoulder. Right there. So essentially, that is the safe and just space for humanity, where we are neither overshooting the planetary boundary nor falling short on life's essentials. It's a place of balance. It's a place where we need to redefine and redesign our economies, our institutions, finance, business, broader economic institutions that shape the reality of what kind of economic outcomes we achieve. And it means we need to move away from some of the 20th century features of the design of our economy and our business world, which is around being degenerative and driving linear models that create waste and drive waste, models that create huge inequality and divisive economies, and ones that are obsessed with growth at all costs. Now, how are we doing? And this is the final bit I just want to quickly show above my left shoulder. This is the reality of where we are. We are both in overshoot on the majority of the planet's boundaries, and we are falling short on life's essentials for hundreds of millions of people around the world. If we are to look at this as a selfie, I think it would be accurate. This is our collective selfie as humanity. It makes me feel unsafe to look at this image, to see that red. That is the red that we have created. That is the overshoot. That is us pushing the planet beyond its carrying capacity. And that is us falling short on the essentials of life in the design that we have created for our economy and the components of that economy. So this is telling us that we are all in a period of transition. We all need to think about how we redesign our businesses, our financial structures, our economies overall. And there is hope. There is hope that we can get out of this red and into the donuts.
Thank you. We really appreciate that perspective, and in particular, I think not just focusing on climate, but also what are the social needs of a population, of our communities. And we really want to focus on some of the positives here in this webinar today, and how we can actually strive forward and create a better place and to try and right the donut. So Emma, I'm going to turn to you. If you could give us that insight and that forward thinking about what would the future look like if we could take into our own hands what Erinch has been talking about in making sure that we're paying attention to the donut.
Thank you. Yes, so for everyone watching, I'm a science fiction author, and I'm making a podcast called Imagining Tomorrow in partnership with Friends of the Earth, which is designed to do just that, to look at the future. But instead of the science fiction I've written, which is dystopian, I've been seeking a utopian future through things which are happening right now. And that is the basis, I feel, of good science fiction, is to look at where we are now and to extrapolate forwards. And in dystopian fiction, we look at the terrible things and extrapolate the natural projection of that into the future. In the Imagining Tomorrow podcast, I've gone and found people who are doing wonderful things right now to bring it very much in line with the Doughnut Economics model. And one of the things that I found in common in so many of the different communities that I've spoken to is that when they unlock one part of the problem, when they find a way to keep money within the local community, then so many of the other problems are alleviated and in some cases solved. So I like there to be concrete, actual practical examples of this, because I don't like to just waffle about theoretical, oh, this is the future we could have. So to give you a concrete example, there's a community in Wales which has got a huge amount of poverty, rural poverty. And one of the issues is that historically, all of the resources of the area have been extracted by external companies, that the money is leached out of the community, basically. And a group of people faced with increasing costs of living and the energy crisis, the climate crisis, 14 years ago got together and said, look, we should do something about this. Everything is getting worse. And so they found a way to build a £1.3 million wind turbine for the benefit of their community. And it just absolutely boggles my mind that they found the way to do that they leveraged funding, loans from a Welsh bank, and found a way to come together as a community to do this. Now, within the rules as they exist in the UK, you can't just set up a solar farm or solar panels in a local community and then everybody just uses that energy. It has to go to the grid. But the way that they unlocked one of the base problems of the area is that in selling that energy to the grid, they could keep the money from that in their community. And through doing that, they've been able to do things like help each other to look at how to better insulate their homes and to make sure that they have warmer homes that are less leaky in terms of heat, but also more comfortable, but also use less energy to heat. They've been able to fund a community orchard. They've been able to build a sustainable eco-build community centre where they can come together, where they can harvest the apples, where they can produce cider, where they can give talks. And from that initial unlocking of that core problem of the money fleeing and not being there to benefit the community, they've started a ripple effect. And this is what I've seen in all of the projects, the people that I've interviewed. The other thing that I want to say is that if you look at a future, we can flip it on its head and say, well, what do we get if we don't try to stay within that donut boundary? And we're already seeing it. We are already seeing the impact of all of that red on the second example. We are seeing climate breakdown. We are seeing huge disparities between people who have far too much money and really not enough to survive. We can see that capitalism, as it's been going through its evolution and striving for profit above all else, is unraveling everything, and the fabric of society, it feels like, is unraveling. And we can all feel this, right? You know, there are people who want to swim in rivers and they're polluted, and just fundamentals like clean water, the right to be able to swim in water that is by your home, all of these things which in that model in the inner circle would be prioritized and safeguarded for people, we can see that breaking down. We can feel this happening around us. So I think that the future, when we're looking at an economy which is not profit above all else, which is not shareholder dividends before all else, could solve so many other problems like we see with the community in Wales. And it builds social cohesion as well, gardening projects, increasing biodiversity, enabling people to grow food locally, getting to know each other, talking about how they can solve problems in their local community. These are the ripple effects that we see. And that's what the donut model would bring us.
Thank you, Emma. I appreciate that. And Erinch, if I could just come back to you before we move on to Mary, just to give us your viewpoint about how do you link this, you know, big picture economic model to what Emma's talking about, which is really grassroots kind of action. You know, how do we link those two?
I think the word that connects what Emma's describing and this very macro perspective is redesign. Because what Emma is describing in community-owned renewable energy, or people taking action to transform the way local assets, the commons operate, for instance, is they are redesigning their economy as they go through this sort of transition. So for me, what excites me is that those businesses, entrepreneurs, investors, community groups, policymakers that are daring to redesign and saying, hey, this isn't, you know, shareholder capitalism isn't something that was just bestowed upon us as a natural law of nature. Like people sat in a room and designed the corporation and said it's got a fiduciary duty to do X and Y, and it must maximize this, and its board looks like that, and its investment models are, you know, these are human inventions. We created them in the 20th century when we weren't really aware of the challenges that the donut portrays for us. We weren't really in a position of understanding of those planetary boundaries, the impacts of inequality on social cohesion, the importance of creating a fair and more just world. There was a different understanding and there was a different design, and we need to let go of those old designs and think, okay, we're now in a world where we need to completely redesign, redefine our economies. And how do we play a role as activists, as entrepreneurs, as employees, as voters and citizens, as any actor in this space, in redesigning the fundamentals of our economy, talking about it and making that the new normal?
Perfect. Thank you for setting that scene very clearly in my mind. And Mary, you're no stranger to taking collective action and disruption. How does Friends of the Earth fit into this? How are we seeing collective action? What's happening, and what's the movement that you're seeing building?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Emma and Rick as well. I think it's really leads very nicely into what I want to say. So I have another R word. We've had redesign, but I actually think relationships is one of the really core words at the heart of this transition as well. At Friends of the Earth, and the clue is slightly in the name, we have been doing this kind of work, this kind of building grassroots power and building collective a movement of people taking action together for over 50 years, because our theory of change is that it's when you building grassroots power and then building from the bottom, but then also connecting with the levers from the top. Bringing those two things together is one of the best routes to influence change. So when we build grassroots power in all the kind of ways through the types of community energy projects, for example, that Emma's been talking about, we leave our communities more resilient. And we also kind of bring to life the future that we want to grow, and that resources people actually to be able to take on from the top some of those big kind of vested interests. So, for example, just this week we have seen a fantastic victory for an organisation called the Wheeled Action Group, led by a woman called Sarah Finch. They're a fantastic group of campaigners who've been campaigning against oil and gas extraction licenses in Surrey for many years. But just last week, the Supreme Court found that the government had acted illegally in failing to take into account the lifetime impacts of the fuel that would be extracted from that site. And I cite that because actually, yes, that's an example of, that was the Wheeled Action Group was in court with support from our lawyers, with support from Greenpeace, with supports of with that legal support and expertise. But that would never have happened if actually someone like Sarah hadn't been resourced in her community with the people around her, with that confidence and those relationships and so on to keep going. So I think we need to really put relationships at the heart of this transition, because that is how we will resource each other and ourselves, for the future. And I want to just perhaps bring a couple of examples of how we do that. I think examples that are quite inspiring in terms of how we do that in practice with this question about how do we build towards a new economy. So one, if you like, slightly new iteration of this grassroots power building work is, I think, harnessing the power of peer learning. Now, peer learning is something we've always done as kind of humans. We've always sat around and figured, like, how do we work together to solve a problem? But there's an organization that I really love in particular called Huddlecraft. They're all about the power of harnessing that power of peer learning. And I know that both us at Friends of the Earth and the Doughnut Economics Action Lab have worked with them in different ways. So for the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, what Huddlecraft did was curate a series of peer-to-peer learning journeys, turning ordinary people like anyone on this call, into what they called, I think, a renegade neighborhood economist. I may get some of these terms wrong, but that was the idea, I think. But basically getting people to come to gather a group in their neighborhood and understand, how does the donuts apply in their neighborhood, and what kind of changes could they start making together and in their neighborhood to stay within those boundaries and to kind of address these issues of overshoot in their neighborhood. But what the genius of it, I think, is creating this structure, this journey that people can go on together, and all those resources. If you want to do that, you can access that on the Doughnut Economics Action Lab and run your own peer learning journey. At Friends of the Earth, we've done something very similar around sustainable finance. So we worked with Huddlecraft to develop something called the Money Movers program, which is a movement of primarily women, but people who've been marginalized from the financial sector broadly, but who are keen to take climate action with their personal finances, and creating a bespoke kind of 3-session journey to support women to come together to figure out what kind of future their money is building, and then actually to kind of make the changes with their personal finances over that period that can start to build and support the new economy that we all want to see. And I think, you know, what's so important here is that what we can see in all these examples is that we need the mechanisms that close the sort of intention to action gap. It's not enough to have the good ideas. You also need to know how you're going to, you also need to have the resource, the relationships, and the support in place to turn good ideas and good intention into action. And because actually change is what happens. Change happens in a social context. Change happens through the power of relationships. And I think that's what we really need to harness in terms of building the new economy. Brilliant,
Mary. Thank you. Loving the practical examples here. We're going to keep that theme. And I know, Emma, you were have been a Money Movers ambassador yourself. And I wonder if you could just perhaps pick out if there's any sort of key learnings, just a real brief couple of points that struck you during your time doing that.
So one of the things that was really apparent is just how many people are scared of finance and how disempowered people are. And in the training session, we were all asked to bring something that represented our relationship with money. And it was so telling, the things that people brought with them that embodied so much fear. Mine was a cactus, because I get very prickly when I have to talk about finances because it's so scary. But also as an author and podcaster, I'm a narrator. So my income is incredibly unstable and is kind of feast and famine. And with cacti, you know, you never know when you're going to get some water, and somehow they just last until the next drenching. So this is one of the things that was really apparent, was just how scary it is and how much that peer model is about the emotional support to face those fears. And that isn't something which is ever really talked about in the kind of the hard world of finance. And, you know, these are all very intellectual, very sensible, very serious decisions. Actually being able to have a space where you could talk about this and support each other past those fears and insecurities was incredibly powerful.
Thanks, Emma. And Erinch, just back to you, the people power and this idea of democratization of finance is obviously something at Ethex we're very proud of supporting and helping to build as a movement. To what extent does that play a part within the Doughnut, and how do we work together with larger sort of institutions and marry those two sort of groups and types of investors with potentially different outcomes within that Doughnut?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. Firstly, I mean, at the heart of what we are observing is that we have created an economy where life is in service to finance, where everything, all of the possibilities in our economy, whether it's sustainability initiatives, whether it's a transition, whatever it might be, whether it's human rights, it's only allowed if it is delivering maximum returns. And that is a huge straitjacket to put on an economy that is in urgent need of transition. So democratizing finance, and there are lots of ways we could talk about this. It could be impact first finance, it could be about social finance, it could be about finance in service of life. There are many terms we can put on it, but essentially what we need to figure out is, how do we enable and unlock the things that aren't happening, whether it is access to renewable energy or access to affordable housing that is ecologically safe in its production, or it's, you know, food and agriculture that is replenishing the soil, that is working in a way that isn't degrading the local ecology, and that is providing fair incomes and a sense of connection to the local community, workers, farmers. All of these transitions, for them to be unlocked, we need certain kinds of finance. And what I'm noticing, and what I've always commended Ethex on this, is its starting point isn't, how can you fit the demands and parameters of finance? It's you're the social entrepreneur or social enterprise or community-owned enterprise. You're driving a solution we need. How do we fit into your needs? How do we redesign finance? The instruments of finance. How do we open up that term sheet if it's equity? How do we design a debt instrument? How do we define the relationship between financial expectations and the way the business evolves? Because otherwise, what we are noticing, and I've now worked with over 700 business leaders in running workshops with them, driving, the biggest ideas, putting them on the table, transitioning away from fast fashion, transitioning towards, ethical production that is ecologically safe across all sectors. And time again, the thing that is holding them back is finance, is them saying, look, I can't do this because it delivers returns, but it's not quite high enough. It has a margin, but the risk is a bit high. And finance won't budge. My investors won't budge. My financiers won't budge. I'm going to have to find solutions that meet their needs. Otherwise, I can't do any of this stuff. And that limitation, I think, gets broken when we're willing to redesign finance to be in service of what the economy actually needs.
Thank you. And we've got some great questions coming in. So I'm going to address those in a moment, because I think that will give us the ability to open out this discussion even further. But first, Tammy, I wanted to come to you and give you an opportunity to give an example of what you're doing at United Repair Centre, which fundamentally creates a business model that, flips consumerism on its head, to help try and address some of these environmental challenges and social challenges. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more, and then we can circle back around in true Doughnut style to the bigger picture again.
Of course. Thank you, Lisa. Well, I first of all, very inspired to be sitting in this panel talking about things that we really care about. And what we're trying to do at United Repair Center is basically looking at the challenge that the Doughnut is making visible to us, and using the system to change the system. So what we do is very simple: clothing repairs. And clothing repair has been the same for the last 200 years, since clothing and mass production of clothing was invented. And what we realize is that in order for businesses to transit into circularity, as you call, new business models for the clothing industry, repair sits really at the core of it. So in order for you to extend the life of clothing, you have to provide repairs as a service for the end consumer. If you want to, instead of selling clothing, to rent clothing, you need to repair the clothing in order for it to be brought back into the market. If you're talking about reselling, you have repair at the score. So we realize that a lot of jobs that will be needed to be created in the future business models of brands have repair at the score. And the funny thing is, in the last 2 decades, we've migrated supply chains to the Far East. And together with it, the expertise that was needed in order for clothing to be simply repaired. So in order for you to, as a consumer, have a qualitative repair of this brand that you perhaps pay a lot of money to, around the corner is sometimes very difficult. And we realize that this talent is actually coming from the margins of society. So we have, especially in Europe, a lot of migration populations that bring textile expertise, and we combine these two. So together with Patagonia, we created a company called United Repair Center, which creates clothing repair at large scale for fashion brands, for clothing brands. And we do this in order to A, facilitate the process for brands in large scale to provide repairs, but B, and perhaps more important to this, create jobs for people that distance to the labor market. And the vehicle to doing this is education. So created an education program that teaches people that are unemployed to understand what does it take to repair clothing at large scale. And we provide this to bring these people to our workforce. So we've been doing this for the last 2 years. And the interesting thing is that we use the case of Patagonia as a blueprint to bring other brands to understand, okay, so what does it take for me to transit to a sustainable or to a circular business model? What does it take in terms of finance, in terms of marketing, in terms of logistics? We take them by the hand, we help to create an infrastructure where they're able to do this. And let's say we glue the parts with technology. So we have a tech platform that will bring clothing can come from A to B to a repair team of experts and back to the end consumer. And throughout this whole process, you create a lot of value. So we get consumers that get very happy that the items got repaired, and they actually learn to create value about the clothing that they are wearing. So we receive here involuntarily a lot of messages saying, hey, thank you for repairing my clothing. You guys rock. That is amazing. And we realize that this emotional connection gets to exist again by connecting consumers through repair. And as opposed to talking through fashion brands on circularity or CO2 emissions and complex terms on sustainability, repair is actually very simple. You can get someone from 8 to 88. Everybody knows what we're talking about. So we use this as a hook for brands to transit. And in the meanwhile, what we call it the double donut, taking care of social justice. So we believe that the problem of migration, which is scaling exponentially, is going hand in hand with the problem of textile industry, which is also scaling exponentially. So we need to combine both in order to create a solution that is at the same time good for the planet, but equally good for people. So creating social cohesion in order to bring positive added value to the planet.
Brilliant, Tammy. That's such a good example of how you can just create business models to solve problems, and comes back to this relationship issue again, doesn't it? It's about continuing the relationship between the consumer and the company that originally created the item, but then interestingly, perhaps relationships between people who have had their items given a second life, and then talking about it and sharing that with other people. And just to come to some of the that relationship issue, but also the end point, how do we connect that top level with the bottom level? Mary, one of the questions that's come in, well, actually two similar ones. Everybody understands where we need to get to. They understand perhaps that they can play a part in that, but how do we create a shift at the top whereby there isn't just a one dimension profit above all else? What are the things that we can do, and what is being done to address that?
Well, I think ultimately in any system there are a number of different intervention points, and there are definitely places where we need to intervene at a higher level in the system. And I think part of the answer to this question that's coming up, and I really understand, is thinking about the regulatory framework. So when I think about United Repair Centre, for example, and I am not particularly familiar, I have to say, with the regulatory framework around kind of textile waste and whatever, but you can be certain that if you have a context where actually the law requires companies to have more responsibility for their waste, then that's going to improve the business model for something like, for a business like United Repair Centre, because that changes the market. So regulation is one way in which we start to shift this market. And obviously this is like, a big problem with lots of different points of intervention. I think one place where we could start is around the pensions industry. So the Finance Innovation Lab produced who are a really interesting organisation, if people don't know them, produced a report back in March alongside I think Share Action and Make My Money Matter, who are both campaigning groups working on these issues. They've got a whole load of recommendations for how to bring pensions in line with these, with the needs of the economy that we, with the needs of a kind of a sustainable economy. I think pensions are really interesting because there is so much capital invested in pensions, but also the thing about pensions is that they are, a great amount of it is actually ordinary people's savings and investments. You don't have to be rich to have to be invested in a workplace pension scheme, and that money that is being invested in currently and being invested in all sorts of things that you really wouldn't want to see it invested in, like fossil fuel extraction and whatever, could be invested in a whole load of other things if some of the rules around pensions investment were shifted. So their recommendations include some things like requiring all pension funds and other financial institutions to adopt science-based 1.5 degrees aligned mandatory transition plans, for example. That's an example of the kind of regulatory framework that could have really big knock-on effects. And also, requiring those big investors to think very differently about risk. So within the financial sector, we have quite a narrow people have quite a narrow understanding of what risk is. It tends to be understood in the sense of, your investment is at risk if, but not actually our planet is at risk if, our future is at risk if. And I often come back to what the great Indian environmentalist Vandana Shiva said many times, which is, it's not an investment if it's destroying the planet. And if we can build that kind of understanding into our financial sector through a gradual process of regulatory reform, then actually I think that would make a big difference to unlocking the kind of capital that people like Tammy need to see, their business really grow and thrive.
Great, Mary. That really helps to link the two together. We need this pincer movement, and organisations like Share Action do a brilliant job of really trying to make organisations much more accountable, and to give and there are other organisations now which are giving individual shareholders much more of a voice, and in using that voice we can hopefully start to create change, even though we know it's going to be take a long time. Emma, what would you like to contribute there?
There's a farm, a regenerative agriculture farm that I interviewed for the Imagining Tomorrow podcast, and they had a model which I thought was a very interesting application of working within a financial structure, but just shifting it to be even more beneficial. So they have a regenerative agriculture farm that grows enough food to do veg boxes for over 200 families in their local area. So obviously locally produced food is great for so many reasons. What I interviewed them about that I was particularly fascinated by is that they ran a community share offer. And within the share offer, they gave investors the option to either take the 3% profit that they would get on their investment guaranteed every year and instead donate it to a solidarity fund. And this fund, the farm used to subsidise the costs of the production of the veg boxes, because it was very important to the farm that all of the workers on the farm were paid a fair living wage as well. And when I interviewed Alice from the farm, she said that nowadays, because of the consumer culture that we've been kind of dragged into over the past few decades, that's dominated by supermarkets and driving down the cost of food, there is a very high cost of food that lots of people are kind of hidden from, and that's the cost to the people and the planet in the way that it's produced. Now, by having this solidarity fund, what they were able to do is to raise funds to ensure that the farm remains in trust, so that it is always owned by the community, is always run as a regenerative, sustainable farm, but they can subsidise the costs of the veg boxes so that local families can get them regardless of their income. It isn't just something that the local wealthy people can afford, it's something that everybody can afford. And I thought that was a really beautiful example of using a financial model that people are used to, but giving the option to people who don't need that money and just want to support something really good to make it better for everybody involved.
Erinch.
I mean, I think there's a really interesting combination of ideas that are merging here. If we look at what, you know, the ideas that Mary, for instance, outlined, and the idea that the example that Emma just provided, I think what we're hearing is that there's a set of things that have to happen, as Mary articulated, that are going to put pressure on companies, regulatory pressure, investor pressure, that changes their behavior, that changes the way they act, whether they're purpose-driven businesses or not, regardless, you know, agnostic to the design of the company and the business and the entrepreneurial, you know, drive that the business has. There are things that need to happen at a market level more systemically. Separately, we need to also redesign the organizations at a very micro level. So we need to zoom in the way Emma described and change the ownership model so that a foundation owns the business, and that fundamentally shifts the opportunity of that business to prioritize people and planet topics. You know, Patagonia famously recently moved over to a model of ownership that is built on the ideas of steward ownership. And steward ownership basically says we can have a model of ownership where money and power are separated in the ownership's design. There are shares that have all the dividend rights, but none of the voting rights. And then there are shares that have all the voting rights, but none of the dividend rights. So we separate money and power, and that changes the incentive structure in the business. Whatever's left still goes to the investors, but they don't have an ability to pressure the company to increase and extract greater returns through every decision. And that liberates decision makers. Now, this is not a new idea. This has been around, particularly in Northern Europe, for decades and decades. Companies like Bosch are owned this way. There are a huge chunk of the Danish corporate world is owned by a foundation in this way. So we've got these sorts of ideas that are redesigning business through steward ownership, of course, cooperatives, of course, asset-locked social enterprises and community interest company models here in the UK. There are lots of these structural features that fundamentally shift how decisions are made, how a company can reinvest internally, what kind of margins it can tolerate, because I think we need to get a little bit more into the money, into how money-related decisions are made in the business, and then how money-related decisions are shaped by the design of the business. And this takes us then to the idea of finance, because the role of finance is pivotal here. And we're beginning to see some really interesting innovations here as well. We're seeing ideas like exit to community, which has been a brainchild of the network Zebras Unite, particularly based out of the US, who worked with the University of Colorado Boulder to come up with a guide on how to design a business so that when the investor leaves, it's a version of community ownership that emerges out of this. Other organizations like Transform Finance have created essentially a very detailed playbook on how to have alternative ownership designs, including employee ownership, community ownership, other forms of steward ownership that can redesign companies and still bring in investors, have them play a role, but define that role very clearly within there. And others like Orny, Pat and Power have written a book called Adventure Finance that are looking at what are the alternatives to venture capital that are creating a particular kind of design, a particular kind of DNA in the business world that is actually holding back the possibilities of being ecologically regenerative and socially distributive in the ways that we're all describing. So I sort of invite us also to think about some of these macro market level interventions that can happen irrespective of the design of the company, and interventions at a micro level where we redesign the business, change its fundamental drive, its priorities, and there's a set of policies to do that as well. Like my final point will be, for instance, in the UK, we're seeing a 37% growth per year in employee-owned businesses because there's a tax break where you don't pay capital gains tax if you sell your business to your workers. And there are policy interventions, public procurement, other regulatory interventions that not only regulate the market, but redesign and fundamentally shift the essence of the business world.
Thank you. And just sort of picking up on some points there as well. And one of the questions in the chat about my Someone saying my renewable energy portfolio, would love to invest in green stuff, but my renewable energy portfolio has not done so well recently. And I wonder if there's a question also about expectations and what our expectations are of investment. Actually, have we been over ambitious in our expectations? Are we being driven by a slightly sort of extractive mentality? Because I mean, I know from the community-based renewable projects, the way that most of them raise finance is through community shares, which is not about any kind of equity appreciation or change in valuation. It's purely based on a fair return on an annual basis, on a very long time scale, very patient and flexible finance, which is what many of these organizations need. But have we got too used to the idea of, high valuations, capital appreciation, and have we slightly got addicted to it? Mary, throw that in your lap.
Wow, I think I would probably say yes. At the same time, I think it's so a couple of things. One is that I think we do perhaps need to adjust our horizons for the longer term. So if you take that example of kind of renewable investments not doing so well. Now, I am not, an energy sector expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I think actually, all the long term, if you look at the growth of the renewable energy sector over the last decade in particular, it's massively outstripped what people would have expected. Even in some ways it's one of the good news stories about the transition, actually, that our kind of solar and wind capacity globally has grown much more quickly than people actually anticipated sort of 15-20 years ago, which is really exciting. And I suspect that actually, if you look at the long-term trajectory of those investments and are willing to be patient, that renewables are going to carry, that the fossil fuel era is over, is only going to get more expensive. The regulatory environment for it is only going to get more difficult, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's an element of, with renewables, I wonder if there's an element of just kind of holding your nerve a little bit. I mean, the other thing I was going to say, though, is that I think we need to think about and I'm going to come back to this point about relationships and community, and what it is that we need to invest in order to why we need that return in our older age in the future. And we need that return, understandably, to provide for ourselves, our families, our loved ones, our dependents in very, very difficult times. But there are other ways in which having the private financial means to do that is not the only way in which we secure a kind of a safe and livable and thriving future for our loved ones. And in the future, we also need public services that operate well. We need strong connections in our neighborhoods. We need networks of connection and interdependence, and thinking about how do we invest in the kind of systems that give us those kinds of returns that actually might be just as well placed, or need to be held in balance with that personal financial security, in order to secure livable futures for our loved ones, which is an entirely understandable drive, but perhaps personal finance isn't the only route to that.
Thanks. And someone was commenting on the Patagonia example being very good in trying to separate money profits from decision-making power. Would that work as at startup? Would the people putting in the startup capital accept a lack of decision-making influence power? Or is it something that works when a successful business is already established? Well, Tammy, perhaps you could tell us, what's your perspective in terms of getting finance for new business models? And I must just say, we're hoping to see Tammy on the Ethex platform in the near future, but what has your experience?
Oh, well, Ethex is a good example of this. I believe that for startups, there's a big misconception with growth and capital. And if especially you're creating a purpose-driven startup, you should be looking for finance with meaning. So in this sense, you should be looking for the right type of investor that understands the purpose of the business and uses finances as a middle to achieve this purpose, not the other way around. So in our case, we do have a stewardship ownership, and we have a golden share of a separate foundation that dictates our year plan, for instance. And that has not been an obstacle for us to achieve and obtain investors for us as a startup. Just because the type of investors we're looking for are investors that are aligned with our purpose. And I believe the appetite for finance to find meaning is growing. We see a lot of change into the landscape of impact investing happening in the last years, and especially with new regulations coming in place, and also the influence of what corporates should do with their revenues. I think there's a big transition in the sector where capital obtaining meaning is being possible also for startups, and we have been an example of this.
Great, thanks, Tammy. Just in terms of, the ripple effect that Emma talked about, how can these small actions ignite major change? Is there anyone from the panel who would like to give their perspective on that? Yes, Erinch.
I mean, Lisa, what I'm noticing, and a lot of my work is on working either at a very micro level with entrepreneurs and financiers to push forward some of these innovations and open up possibilities, and then to speak up about it and try to drive narrative shift that this is possible. And what I'm noticing is that these ideas initially get dismissed and marginalized as being things for the sort of cute, peculiar parts of the economy. That this isn't really an idea to drive the mainstream economy. And then you get to a certain point, and then they realize, actually, this is a real alternative. And this is something that could transform the mainstream economy. And some fight it at that point, and some begin to embrace it. And I think thinking of ourselves as being sort of a community of innovators that are trying to prepare the ideas for the next economy. There's something that Milton Friedman said that that I admire. There aren't that many things he said that I admire, but one thing he said, and he's essentially the godfather of neoliberal shareholder capitalism. He said, when a crisis hits, people will be looking around for the ideas that are laying around. And this is what we're creating. We're creating the ideas that are not just laying around, but are a proof of concept. And I think if we think of ourselves as being those experiments of design for the future, and we're preparing for the crises, and we're preparing for the disruptions, after which people will be searching for the ideas that could work, that could help us transition, then I think we start to change hearts and minds in that direction. And we start to realize that it's not just about the incremental change we can achieve today, but it's about preparing all of us and all of our audiences for a much bigger change that is both hopeful and that is fun. This is fun to redesign the economy. The old economy is boring and onerous and burdensome and beats the hope out of you. This is the hopeful space of design that we all occupy. And I think projecting that really helps to shift hearts and minds.
Thank you. Emma, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind is the shift in attitudes towards the use of spaces for the benefit of biodiversity. I'm thinking about just over the last 5 years, traveling around both my local area and going to other places, seeing more grouse verges which are being allowed to grow and which are being purposefully seeded with flowers. And that's a tiny thing, but this is something which has shifted just within the last 5 to 10 years. And talking to people for the podcast who have been doing community gardening projects and looking at it right up to a shift in land use policy, where farmers are now being given payments to set aside portions of land to have wildflowers and to have bigger margins for wildlife benefit. I think that is something which is an example of that was very much marginalized. You know, NEP started 20 odd years ago. Nobody was talking about rewilding and doing things for the benefit of biodiversity. And it just feels like this is something which is now becoming bigger and snowballing. So lots of tiny pockets of people doing things like the Trees for Life project up in Scotland. You know, that they've been doing this for decades, and only now it feels like it's really bursting into the public consciousness. So I think that's another example of a ripple effect.
Mary.
Yes, I think that's a beautiful illustration of how this operates in all sorts of ways. And I know I can think of sort of many more examples where, you know, there was you know, ideas, if you like, were kind of ridiculed and now kind of becoming mainstream, and you don't necessarily know which of those are going to be. I think I would say, I think a really interesting way to think about this is the concept of social contagion as a kind of model for, you know, instead of perhaps a traditional model of kind of scaling where you kind of, you know, plan to start big and then grow. Actually, things will kind of grow to their appropriate size, but you never quite know who is going to be, you know, you never quite know who's going to be kind of contaminated by your idea. I think that's a really lovely way of thinking about it. Actually, we seed these ideas and they become contagious, and I think that's what kind of what we should be looking towards.
Tammy, any last comments from you?
Well, I can only echo. I really believe that we are sitting in a very special moment in our history. We are the last generation that still have the opportunity to make change, and we see this happening in a grassroots level, but we also see a combination on legislation and finance taking heads towards change. And I think it's upon us to take the step and make it tangible and make it practical and make it in transition, as we mentioned, using the system to change the system, because there's only time to act, which is today.
Perfect. Well, someone has helpfully created some summary points and takeaways from the meeting. So that's really helpful for me. We will copy the chat because there's been some really useful resources that have been posted by everyone and some questions perhaps that we didn't get time for. So can I just say thank you to everyone for taking a really positive approach to this. And I think it's only appropriate that during London Climate Action Week, we're really hopefully championing action both at a local level and a top level as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time listening in, and thank you to the panelists. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.